Alam Bux and the Big Black Bear by Kenneth Anderson. The story I am now about to relate concerns a sloth bear, quite a big, black, and bad bear. All bears, as I have had occasion to remark in other stories, are excitable, unreliable, and bad-tempered animals. They have a reputation for attacking people without apparent reason, provided that person happens to pass too close, either while the bear is asleep or feeding or just ambling along. So the natives give bears a wide berth. Together with the elephant, they command the greatest respect of the jungle-dwelling folk. This particular bear was exceptional among his kind for his unwarranted and exceptionally bad temper and aggressiveness. He would go out of his way to attack people even when he saw them a long distance away. The reason for his unusual conduct was difficult to explain. There were many stories about him, which were as varied as they were extraordinary. The most unpretentious was that he was quite mad. Other stories had it that he was a she who had been robbed of her cubs and had sworn a vendetta against the human race. I think that the bear had been wounded or injured at some time by some human being. Perhaps the most fantastic of the stories was to the effect that this bear, almost a year previously, had kidnapped an Indian girl as a mate while she was grazing a flock of goats on the hill where he lived. The story went on to say that the whole village had turned out en masse to rescue the girl, which they had finally succeeded in doing, much to the bear's annoyance, and he had then taken to attacking human beings in retaliation. Whatever the reason be, this bear had quite a long list of victims to his credit. I was told that some 12 persons had been killed and 24 others injured. Like all bears, he invariably attacked the face of the victim, which he commenced to tear apart with his tremendously long and powerful claws, in addition to biting viciously with deliberate intent to ensure the success of his handiwork. Quite half the injured had lost one or both eyes. Some had lost their noses, while others had had their cheeks bitten through. Those who had been killed had died with their faces almost torn from their heads. Local rumors had it that the bear had also taken to eating his victims, the last 3 of whom had been partly devoured. I had no opportunity to verify the truth of these rumors, but felt that they might be true to some extent, as the Indian sloth bear is a known devourer of carrion at times, although generally he is entirely vegetarian, restricting himself to roots, fruit, honey, white ants, and similar delicacies. So fresh meat, even human meat, might not be unwelcome. This bear originally lived in the Navgara Hills, which lie to the east of the large town of Arsikere, some 105 miles northwest of Bangalore and in the state of Mysore. It was on these hills that he had perpetrated his earliest offenses. Then, as he lost his fear of mankind and grew bolder, for no apparent reason he came down to the plains and commenced to harass people in their fields at dawn and dusk. He would come out from one or the other of the numerous small, boulder-strewn hillocks that were dotted here and there to forage for food. I had been hearing occasional stories of this animal for about a year, but had not paid much attention to them, as I felt that, like nearly all the stories one hears in India of maulings and killings by wild animals, they were greatly exaggerated. Furthermore, as I think I have mentioned somewhere else, Bruin is quite an old friend of mine against whom I have no antipathy. I was therefore most disinclined to go after him. But there came an incident that made me do so. I have an old friend, an aged Muslim named Alam Bux, who is the guardian of a Mohammedan shrine situated on the main road which leads past Arsikere and on to Shimoga. This shrine is the burial place of a Mohammedan saint who lived some 50 years ago, and like hundreds of similar shrines scattered over the length and breadth of India, is preserved and held sacred by the Muslim community. Each shrine has its own guardian or caretaker, invariably some old man who is quartered at the shrine itself to keep it clean and care for it. One of his particular duties is to light a lamp over the shrine, which is kept burning all night to signify that the memory of the saint burns ever brightly in the bosoms of the faithful. I first met Alam Bux on a dark night while motoring from Bangalore to Shimoga on my way to a tiger hunt. The rear wheel of my Studebaker flew off and the back brake drum hit the road with a terrific jolt. I happened to be alone at the time, and stepping out of the car, viewed the situation with considerable disgust and annoyance. Fortunately for me, the incident had taken place almost opposite the shrine, and old Alam Bux, waking up at the noise made by the brake drum striking and dragging along the road, came out to see what it was all about. Seeing my predicament, the old man volunteered to help me, which he did to a very considerable extent by bringing a lantern from his abode, gathering stones to serve as packing while I raised the axle of the car, and last, but by no means least, by serving me with a bowl of hot tea. I thanked the old man after he had replaced the truant wheel, and promised that I would look him up whenever I happened to pass his little hut again. This promise I had faithfully kept, and I never failed to bring the old man something by way of supplies on any occasion that I happened to pass. Some 400 yards beyond the shrine is a small knoll of heaped boulders, among which grew the usual lantana shrub. All around this knoll and right up to the shrine and adjacent roadway were fields in which the villagers grew groundnuts after the monsoon rains. Now, bears are very fond of groundnuts, and our big black bear was no exception to this rule. The boulder-covered hillock offered a convenient lodging, and the groundnut fields were a great attraction, so he took up residence among the rocks. He made his abode in a deep recess beneath an overhanging boulder. Hungry by sunset, he could be seen coming forth from his cave, and as twilight deepened into nightfall, he would amble down the knoll and come out onto the groundnut fields. Here he would spend a busy night, eating, uprooting, and generally shuffling about over a wide area throughout the hours of the darkness. Early dawn would find him replete, with his belly full of roots and nuts, white ants, grubs, and other miscellaneous fodder which he had come across during the hours of his foraging. Leisurely he would climb back to his abode, there to spend the hot hours of the day in deep and barely slumber. I forgot to mention that a small tank, which is the Indian colloquial name for a natural lake, was conveniently situated on the other side of the hillock, so that our friend, this bad bear, wanted for nothing. About this time, the fig trees that bordered the main road, which ran past the little shrine, came into season, and their clusters of ripe red fruit filled the branches, spilling onto the ground beneath, carpeting the earth in a soft, red, spongy mass. Hundreds of birds of all varieties fed on the figs during the day. At night, scores of flying foxes, the large Indian fruit bat resembling in size and appearance the far-famed vampire bat, would come in their numbers, flapping about with leathern wings, screeching, clawing, and fighting among themselves as they gormandized the ripe fruit. These numerous visitors, both by day and night, would knock down twice the number of figs they ate, which added to the profusion of fruit already lying scattered on the ground, blown down by the wind and often falling of their own weight. All this offered additional attraction to the bear, which now found a pleasing change to his menu. It was there in abundance, just waiting to be eaten. So from the fields he would visit the fig trees, and thus his foraging brought him into the precincts of the shrine. That is how the trouble began. Alam Bux had a son, a lad aged about 22 years, who, together with the guardian's aged wife and younger sister, lived at the shrine. One night the family had their meal at about 9 and were preparing to go to bed when the boy, for some reason, went outside. It happened to be a dark night, and the bear also happened to be eating figs in the vicinity. Seeing the human figure suddenly appear, he felt that this was an unwarranted intrusion and immediately attacked the youth. More by accident than deliberately, the bear bit through the youth's throat and not the face, which was his usual first objective. The boy tried to scream and had kicked and fought. The bear bit him again, this time through the nose and one eye, and clawed him severely across his chest, shoulders, and back. Then it let him go and loped away into the darkness. The boy staggered back to his parents, streaming with blood. His jugular vein had been punctured, and although they had tried to staunch the bleeding with such rags as were available, they failed in their attempt to save his life, which ebbed away in the darkness as cloth after cloth and rag after rag became soaked in his blood. The false dawn witnessed the youths passing, while the old bear, replete with figs and groundnuts, climbed back to his cave among the boulders. Alam Bux was a poor man, and could not afford the money to send me a telegram, nor could he afford fare to Bangalore either by train or by bus. But he sent me a postcard on which was scrawled the sad story. It was written in pencil in shaky Urdu script. It was stained with the tears of his sorrow. The postcard arrived 2 days later, and I left for Arsikere within 3 hours. I had anticipated that the shooting of this bear would be an easy matter, and that it would take an hour or two at the most. Therefore, I did not go prepared for a long trip. I carried just my torch, .405 Winchester rifle, and a single change of clothing. I reached Alam Bux shortly after 5 in the evening, and it did not take him long to tell me his story. There was no moonlight at this time. Nevertheless, the plan to be followed seemed a simple one, namely to wait till it grew quite dark and then set forth to search for the bear with the aid of my torch. With this procedure in view, Alam Bux allowed me inside his abode by sunset and closed the door to give the appearance that all was quiet. In the dingy little room, we chatted in the flickering light of a small oil lamp, while he repeatedly lamented the death of his son. In fact, within a few minutes, the whole family were weeping and wailing. I had, perforce, to listen to this continuously till 8, when I could stand it no longer and decided to go out in search of the bear. Loading my rifle and seeing that the torch was functioning properly, I stepped outside, Alam Bux closing and bolting his door behind me. The darkness was intense, and as I pressed the switch of the torch fixed near the muzzle of the rifle, its bright beams shone forth over the groundnut fields to my left and the dense aisle of fig trees bordering the road to my right. The bear was nowhere in sight, and so I started to look for him, beginning with the fig trees. These trees grew on both sides of the road, so I judged the best thing to do would be to walk along the road itself, swinging my rifle from one side of the road to the other. I walked in this fashion away from Arsikere for about 1.5 miles, but saw no signs of the bear. I then walked back to the shrine and continued in the opposite direction for another 1.5 miles, but there were still no signs of the bear. So I came back to the shrine and started to search the groundnut fields. Bright glimmers of various pairs of eyes glared back at me, reflected by the torch beam, but they proved to be those of rabbits and 3 or 4 jackals. I circumvented the hillock and walked along the margin of the tank on the other side, where I came across a small sounder of wild pigs wallowing in the mud. But still no sign of the old bear was to be seen. I then walked closer to the foot of the knoll and around it 2 or 3 times, shining my light upwards and in all directions. It was tiring work, and the old bear still did not put in his appearance. On the 3rd occasion, I almost stepped upon a very large Russell's viper that was coiled between 2 rocks in my direct path. Engaged as I was, looking for the reflecting gleam of the bear's eyes, I did not watch the ground before me. My foot was within a few inches of the viper when he inflated his body with a loud, rasping hiss, preparatory to striking. Instinctively, I heeded his warning not to come any nearer and leapt backwards, at the same time shining the torch directly upon the snake, which lunged forth with jaws apart to bite the spot where, just a moment before, my legs had been. It was a narrow shave, and for the moment I felt like shooting the viper. But that would have caused a tremendous disturbance and might frighten away the bear in addition to wasting a valuable cartridge. After all, the snake had been good enough to warn me, and so in return I threw a small stone at it, which caused it to slither away beneath the rocks. By this time, it was evident that the bear had either gone out earlier in the evening and wandered far away, or else he was not hungry and was still in his cave. I returned to Alam Bux's shack and decided to make another tour in a couple of hours. This I did, and made 2 further tours after that, making 4 in all, but the bear was not to be seen, and the false dawn found me still vainly circling the hillock in search of the enemy. With daylight, I told Alam Bux that I would return to Bangalore, but he begged me to stay for the day and to climb the hill and search the cave for the bear. In the meantime, his wife had prepared some hot chapatis, or round flat cakes made from wheat flour, and a dish of steaming tea, both of which I consumed with relish. Then I fell asleep. At about noon, Alam Bux woke me to say that his wife had prepared special pulao rice in my honor. Thanking him for this, I tucked into it too, and in a very short time polished off the lot. Mrs. Alam Bux appeared highly gratified that I so relished her cooking. The sun was now at its meridian and shone mercilessly on the rocks which blazed and shimmered in the noonday heat. It would be a good time to go look for the bear, I knew, assuming he was at home, as he would be fast asleep. Alam Bux came with me up the hill, and from a distance of 50 yards pointed out the shelving rock beneath which the bear had its cave. I clambered upwards on tiptoe, the rubber soles of my shoes making no sound on the rocks. But against this advantage, I was soon to feel a greater disadvantage, as the heat from the sun-baked stone penetrated the rubber and began to burn the soles of my feet. Coming up to the entrance of the cave, I squatted on my haunches and listened attentively. Now, a sleeping bear invariably snores, often as loud as does a human being. If the bear was fast asleep, as I hoped he would be, I counted upon hearing that telltale sound. But no sound greeted my ear, and after sitting thus for almost 10 minutes, the sun began making itself felt through the back of my shirt. Some pebbles lay at hand, and picking up a few, I began to throw them into the cave. Now, such a procedure is calculated to make any sleeping bear very angry, but I could still hear nothing. So I went closer to the entrance and threw the stones right inside. Still nothing happened. I threw more stones, but again with negative results. The bear was not in his cave. Descending the hill, I told Alam Bux the news and announced my intention to return to Bangalore, asking him to send me a telegram if the bear put in a further appearance. I gave him some money, both for the cost of the telegram and to tide him over immediate expenses. Then I left for Bangalore. A month elapsed, and I heard nothing more. About 20 miles across country, and in a northwesterly direction from where the shrine is situated, the forest of Chikmagalur in the Kadur district of Mysore begins. About halfway between Chikmagalur and Kadur stands the small town of Sakrapatna, surrounded by the jungle. The next news that came to me was that a bear had seriously mauled 2 woodcutters near Sakrapatna, one of whom had later died. The district forest officer, or DFO, of Chikmagalur wrote to me, asking if I would come and shoot this bear. I concluded that it was the same bear that had been the cause of the death of Alam Bux's son, but to look for one particular bear in the wide range of forest was something like searching for the proverbial needle in a haystack, and so I wrote back to the DFO to try and get more exact information as to the whereabouts of the animal. After 10 days, he replied that the bear was said to be living in a cave on a hillock some 3 miles from the town, near the footpath leading to a large lake known as the Iron Keer Lake. Also, that it had since mauled the forest guard who had been walking along this path on his regular beat. and so I motored to Chikmagalur, picking up the DFO, and proceeded to the town of Sakripatna, where there is a small rest house owned by the Mysore Forest Department. Here I set up my headquarters for the next few days. As luck would have it, or bad luck if you call it that, the very next afternoon a man came running to the bungalow to tell us that a cattle grazier, his brother in fact, had been grazing his cattle in the vicinity of the very hill where the bear was supposed to be living when he had been attacked by the animal. He had screamed for help, and his cries had been mingled with the growls of the bear. His brother, who was lower down the hill and nearer the footpath, hearing the sounds, had waited no longer, but had fled back to the bungalow to bring us the news. Now, bears are essentially nocturnal animals, never moving about during daylight. At most, they may be met with at dusk or early dawn, but certainly not in the afternoon. Probably the unfortunate grazier had strayed too close to some spot where the bear had been sleeping, causing it to attack him at that unusual time. That could be the only reason for this strange attack. It was nearing 4:30 p.m. when he brought us this news, and I set forth with my rifle and torch and 3 or 4 helpers to try to rescue the grazier who had been attacked. We soon found that the distance to the spot was much greater than we had been told by the unfortunate man's brother. I figured I had walked nearly 6 miles into the jungle before we came to the foot of a hill that was densely covered with scrub, including clumps of bamboo. It was then nearly 6 o'clock, and being winter, it was getting dark. The men I had brought along refused to come further, and said that they would return to Sakripatna, advising me to accompany them and suggesting that we should go back next morning to continue our search. The brother of the missing man volunteered to wait where we stood, but was too fearful to come further into the jungle. The most he could do to help me in finding his missing relative was vaguely to indicate with a wave of his arm the general area where the attack had occurred. I went forward in that direction, calling loudly the name of the man who had been mauled. There was no answer to my shouts, and I advanced deeper and deeper into the scrub. By this time it was almost dark, but I did not feel perturbed, as I had brought my torch and began to flash it about as I sought a way through the undergrowth. Soon it became so dense that I could make no further progress, and was on the point of turning back when I thought I heard a faint moan away in the distance. The ground at this point sloped downwards into a sort of valley that lay between 2 ridges of the hill, and the moan seemed to come from somewhere in the recesses of this valley. The missing man's name was Timma, and cupping both hands to my mouth, I shouted this name lustily, waiting every now and then to listen for a reply. Yes, there undoubtedly it was again, a moaning cry, feeble but nonetheless audible. It definitely came to me from the valley. Forcing my way through the thickets, I struggled down the decline, slipping on rocks and loose stones, catching myself every now and then on the thorns. After a couple of 100 yards of such progress, I called again. After some time, I heard a moaning answer, somewhere to my right. I proceeded in this fashion, following the cry till I eventually found Timma, lying at the foot of a tree in a puddle of his own blood. His face was a mass of raw flesh and broken bones, and the only way of distinguishing that he was breathing was by the bubbles of air that forced themselves through the clotting blood. In addition, the bear had raked him across the stomach with its claws, tearing open the outer flesh so that a loop of intestine protruded. He was hardly conscious when I found him, and I soon realized that what I had taken to be a moaning reply to my calls were just the groans he kept making every now and then in his delirium. The situation was critical, and after examination I saw that another night's exposure would cause him to die by morning. There was therefore no alternative but to carry him back to the spot where I had left his brother. Lifting him onto my shoulder was a tricky business, in the terrible state that he was in. To make matters worse, he was a heavily built man, equal to myself in weight. But I managed to lift him up, and using my rifle butt as a prop, began to struggle upwards the way I had come. I never wished to experience again so terrible a journey. I had almost gained the ridge down which I had lately come when the accident occurred. My left foot slipped and came down heavily between two boulders. There was a sharp, shooting, wrenching pain as I collapsed on the rock with Timma on top of me while the rifle clattered to the ground. I had sprained my ankle and was now myself unable to walk. From where we lay, I began to shout to the brother, but after nearly an hour I realized he could either not hear me or would not hear me. There was no alternative but to spend the night with the dying man. Desiring to make the torch batteries last the night, if that were possible, I refrained from using them more than was necessary. The early hours of the morning became bitterly cold, and Timma's groans became more and more feeble, till eventually they turned into a gurgle. I realized he was dying. At about 5 a.m. he died, and there I sat beside him till daylight eventually came shortly after 6. I then made a determined effort to drag myself to my feet, but found my leg would not support my weight. I tried to crawl, but the thorns formed an impenetrable barrier. They tore my hands, my face, and my clothing to shreds. I soon gave it up and became reconciled to the fact that I would have to wait till a rescue party came to search for us. It was well past noon before the forest department people, accompanied by Timma's brother and a dozen villagers, came anywhere near the scene. Eventually, guided by my shouts, they located us, and that evening I was back at Sakripatna Forest Bungalow, lying on the cot with an immensely swollen ankle. The DFO turned up at about 9 o'clock and drove me in my car to Chikmagalur, where I went to the local hospital for treatment. It was a week before I managed to hobble around. You may guess that by this time I was extremely angry with myself at the delay, and more so with the big, bad, black bear that had caused all the trouble. I was determined that I would get him at any cost, just as soon as I could walk. In the meantime, he had not been idle, but had mauled 2 more men who had been walking along the path to the Iron Care Lake. 4 days later saw me back at Sakripatna, just about able to walk, although not for long distances. Here I was told that the bear had taken to visiting some fields about a mile from the village, bordered by boram trees, the fruit of which was just then coming into season. At 5 p.m. I reached the trees in question, and selecting the largest, which had the most fruit, decided to spend the night at its foot, hoping that the bear showed up. I sat on the ground with my back to the trunk, my rifle across my knees. Shortly after 11, I heard the grunting, grumbling sound of an approaching bear. He stopped frequently, no doubt to pick up some morsel, and as he came closer, I heard the scratching sounds he made in digging for roots. He took nearly an hour to reach the boram tree, by which time I was amply prepared. Finally, he broke cover and ambled into the open, a black blob silhouetted in the faint glimmer of the stars. I pressed the torch switch, and the beams fell on him. He rose on his hind legs to regard me with surprise, and I planted my bullet in his chest between the arms of the white V mark that showed clearly in the torchlight. And that was the end of that really bad bear. Bears, as a rule, are excitable but generally harmless creatures. This particular bear carried the mark of Cain, in that he had become the wanton and deliberate murderer of several men whom he had done to death in the most terrible fashion without provocation. The end.